Hello and welcome to another episode of the Net Podcast. I am Dave Tucker, one of your regular hosts. Joining me today is Brent Salisbury and Tom Nadeau. Sadly, Kyle Mestry can't be with us, so we can't ask him more questions about Service Mesh. But we do have two fantastic guests for you. We have Truman Boys and Jeremy Schumann. Welcome to the show, guys. Truman, why didn't you introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, Truman Boys. I'm the Senior Vice President of Tech Infrastructure for Major League Baseball. So basically all things, kind of from acquisition of video, all the ballpark operations through our cloud networks and all the pieces in between. Prior to that, I ran infrastructure and networks for a financial organization and have a long history in the networking world and been involved in IETF and other fun places involving networks. So, yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome. Jeremy?
Yeah, hi. My name is Jeremy Schulman. I work in Truman's organization, and I'm responsible for all things network automation and heading up those types of activities. I'm embedded with the network engineering team, so I'm kind of a software engineer in that team. And then I work cross-functionally with the other folks in the other infrastructure teams under Truman. So Major League Baseball is actually the first time I've ever worked on the customer side of the shop. So this is my first experience being on that side of the table. Before then, I was 20 years in networking on the vendor side, first as a software engineer and then held many field and business positions. And kind of now coming back full circle is doing software engineering.
That's really
Jeremy,
cool.
I think the first time I met you, you were doing a presentation at Network Field Day, and you were talking automation. That's probably almost 10 years ago, and you were with Juniper. It's pretty cool. You had good vision back then and still do.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember that.
I think that was right around when I met you. It was like right around when I met Truman. I was at Juniper, actually, and that was when you had gone over to the other place pretty soon after that, right?
Yeah, I had. I spent a lot of time with Juniper. I was with Juniper for nearly 12 years. Cruising around most of Asia Pacific and building networks out there.
It was interesting because that was the beginning of like what I call real automation. It wasn't like just bash scripting. We were starting to, and Jeremy, you were up to your eyeballs at that point in it, right? And this kind of reminded me that we had John on, Brent, a couple of weeks ago, right? And around the sort of evolution of automation and that whole thing. So really, really interesting area for sure. And like interesting, like what's your guys' perspective on like, then and now? Is it better now? What are we doing now? Maybe like what are we doing? It's better. Maybe what's worse.
I think more people are accepting that software is going to play a significant role in the automation and in the orchestration within the entire, I'd say, landscape of networking and systems. They've merged so much tighter together, and it used to be heresy to say that a system was going to run BGP. It's like there was a clear demarcation, there was a clear line in the sand. You guys put a packet on a wire, and the network team will get you there. And I think over time it's definitely changed. You talk about the early days of some of that automation and provisioning. This is before we had OpenConfig. We had things like JunoScript and a bunch of, before everything was Yangified, it was, lots of XML. And, we're just kind of changing the language as we move ahead. Still exciting. I mean, I think the main piece that I would draw a parallel to would be that, humans make mistakes, and the more that you can template, or you can build into just like cookie cutter Lego blocks within any kind of framework, any system. I mean, that's the piece that resonates. And how you decide to do it is really, much left to implementation and experience. But the pieces that really work for me is like, can you ensure that, okay, if you can describe what an error condition looks like, well, then how do you prevent that from ever happening again? And there are ways to do that, to build, learning behavior.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like what you described is what used to be done in QA, what was called QA, right? When I was at Cisco and places like that, there was this mad scramble to automate and do what you're doing, what you just described, which is to find the fault conditions, and then once we found them, we patch them, and then hopefully not find them again. But of course, that definitely you can undo your fixes, right? But to me, it's like the interesting thing. I'm curious, like what Jeremy thinks about this too, is that what you described, it was sort of a tactical thing. Like that's how this has evolved, right? Like, and we can automate, first we automated like event logging and events and processing and deduplication and, and then finally, I don't know, what was that, like 5-7 years ago, we really stepped into provisioning and orchestration, right? And that was like whoa, don't touch that. That's some pristine black magic in there. And now, I'm curious how you guys are handling that now.
Yeah, I mean,
in the modern context.
Yeah, so it is interesting because I remember again meeting Brent. This is probably circa 2020, 2012, 2013 maybe, and we were doing the Puppet runs on a Juniper switch kind of story. And that was exciting, partly because Puppet was interesting, but more because of what it meant. The infrastructure of code, kind of how that mentality progressed and what it meant to the rhythm of a business, right? And I remember presenting even at PuppetConf, and that's when I met John Willis, and he kind of ran up to me and introduced himself, and he said, "Hey, it's about time the networking guys or people started, looking at infrastructure as code." And this is before the word DevOps was a thing, right? I mean, this is how long ago this was.
Yeah,
and
the infrastructure as code thing, actually, that's exactly what he talked about with us the other day, and he said that it was like shocking, right?
Yeah.
It was like total heresy. What are you talking about, man? Well, you can't touch that stuff.
Yeah. Well, what was really amazing is that John kind of took me under his wing, and he said, "This is what happened when the systems world, the systems admin went through I was banging bash scripts on a Unix thing, and then I started using Puppet, and I asked him a whole bunch of questions, and really what it came down to was it would be a 10-year journey. It was going to be 10 years from the time that we started in networking to the time where we got kind of proficient in the business rhythm of using this type of technology. So if you think about that, we're in year 7 from that date, and we really didn't start really getting the ball really rolling maybe until like a few years later than that. And I think from my perspective, the real turning point was when Cisco really invested in DevNet. Like they said, here's an environment in which businesses can spend their budget to send people for training, a curriculum, and all things, so that companies, like MLB could, spend their budget that way, where there's training budget and have a vehicle by which there's motivation to learn. So if you look at that was only like really a few years ago, like maybe.
So do you think that took that long because it was the tech or was it the people?
Well, I
the
think
organizational issues, was that or what,
I always go back to, I think it was is the juice worth the squeeze kind of expression. Service providers, they've been investing in this type of thing for decades because it's the rhythm of their business. Without it, they fail. Enterprise companies, along the spectrum are still trying to figure out, is it worth it? Is it worth me, to do this amount of effort? Truman looks at like, should I hire people like Jeremy, or should I hire, other types of people? When I was at Juniper, they would ask the question, should we invest in DevOps as a sales, as a sales process, or should we hire more people to fix bugs for, our product? I mean, people make trade-offs.
Yeah, and it's interesting. A lot of vendors treat automation, or did treat automation, even at my last gig, treat it as almost a professional services add-on, not an intrinsic thing. And it's funny, like if you hear the newer sort of companies are out there, like Rakuten, Tariq always says, ruthless automation, 100% automation, or I don't want to talk to you about it. That's really different, right, than what you've been hearing from other people, right?
And I love how Truman put it as templating, right? I think that's something that translates well to network operations. Jeremy, I didn't have DevNet on my bingo card for transforming this. That's actually pretty damn interesting what they did with curriculum and certifications over the years. That's I've never even thought of that. It's pretty cool. So Truman, when you talk about templating, I think that that resonates, right? Because ops 20 years ago, we would have a text file and we would said awk at best like a VLAN ID or a BGP peer or whatever, right? And then blast that out a bunch of switches. I remember almost 10 years ago talking to a guy who ran Bluehost, CTO there. He blew my mind. He's like, yeah, we don't allow any manual changes, no manual changes to the entire network. I'm like, oh my God, right? Like it was kind of a light bulb moment, right? Because it's like, yeah, because that's when we go back and look at 90% of our outages that aren't bridging loops, or are bridging loops created by people making changes that create that bridging loop or whatever, right? So how are you guys, maybe drill in on, do you all use specific tools? Are you rolling your own tools? How's that going?
I think there's a mixture of tools. We definitely are not dogmatic on it. There's a series of things that are continued to be developed in-house, and Jeremy has actually, I'd say, substantially changed the thinking behind how we build the network. So if I were to kind of just play it back, where we started was, what you described. There's a way to build a BGP config. There's a way to build a ACL, and those existed as equivalents of text files, and maybe they were checked into some repository. And that's an iterative kind of refining process. I think over time, where you want to move it to is enabling the developers to get exactly what they want. So you can have a little bit of the intent structure, and I think we can talk about that. And the other aspect to it is self-serve parts of the network, not just for developers, but for infrastructure personnel. And so there's a slight variation here. Think about who the consumer is. The consumer might be somebody interfacing with the network at an application level. So developers, like, I need to do something on the network, and here's how I want to ask that of the network. And then secondly, we have folks that go out into ballparks and they need to do work out there, and they may not even understand all the components or need to know all the configurations and operational methods of our technologies, but they need to go and check that a port is up and running. So there's some steps that we performed in this area to really automate that, and Jeremy could probably speak to that in more detail.
Yeah, and thank you. And this highlights kind of the organizational impact of automation, not just from the networking point of view, but what I really enjoy at MLB is, in our infrastructure organization, there are systems, there's cloud, there's corp infra, there's net infra, and each of us within these different kind of pillars, we collaborate together so that when we look at examining data that's happening in our infrastructure, what's happening in the network is just a kind of domain piece of it. But looking across our domains, so if somebody was trying to, understand the traffic across our clouds and on-prem and across, various artifacts of our infrastructure, having all that information together and accessible or democratized across, our teams is so, it was so eye-opening to see it happen, being on the side of the kind of the table, being, at a customer, so to speak. And the example that Truman's talking about is, we've got ballpark infrastructure folks out there. These are the guys on the ground level. And they're cabling things. They're troubleshooting cameras. Their time is so valuable, and they don't want to open a trouble ticket to see what is the light level of a particular interface. They want a self-service experience. And so we implemented that with Slack as a chat ops. We use Slack here as our communication systems. And that even that platform offers us a very rich user experience where you can have drop downs and dialogues and buttons, and so that it makes it very intuitive for them to use on their phone or their tablet. And then it's a self-serving benefit because now we draw down the amount of time that's impacting our network operations. And so if you look back at the Phoenix Project or any stories like that where they talk about you really want to draw down the little paper cuts of time so that you then build back a budget where you can invest in doing more valuable activities.
Yeah, and that's the thing we were talking about kind of offline about the sort of the combination of the network with the applications, or sort of the applications perspective on the network now. It's not like it's a special thing. It's a combination of those sort of resources, like you're saying, for somebody who's trying to get a job done, doesn't want to file 3 different tickets, wants to just get it done, and all of these things are contributing to that, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Truman.
I was going one part that I'd say implicitly is a benefit is the fact that we have an end-to-end view and an organization. Like within my team, we basically have everything from the media folks that are a consumer of the network. So, they're doing video encoding and distribution of video content, which then turns into multicast. And so then you have networking people that have to play a role in how that multicast delivery happens. And then you have systems people that have to consume some of that video content and then, hand it off to CDNs and the like. And so, organizationally having one team that can service, all the bits. At the end of the day, for us, it's all zeros and ones, and it's just, it's one team that cares about the delivery. And the other piece I was going to draw together is what we've seen in the systems world is exactly what we'd like to see happen in the networking world. So, this idea of systems that are effectively immutable, or that we're not constantly rebuilding or making changes on the fly to systems. We have an intent of what they should do, and the function is well understood, and we deploy that function. So, this idea around you can go to the details of it, but where does an ACL live? It's wherever we want it to live, but we come up with this beforehand, and it's not something which is added on the fly. So it's less prone to having, significant issues operationally. And then, I think the other piece that we're seeing is just the tooling. The tooling has changed. We're moving away from this idea that, we want to have long trend analysis as well as, short history exposure. So this idea of, let's say, even looking for needles in the haystack, of course, log all the things, try to find anomalies. But that plays a significant role in having a self-healing network, because you're able to see interesting patterns. And it's not just, here's some octets graphed on a chart. It's here's a pattern. It happens every Wednesday. And the end result is that we see some causality with, a network issue that turns into a video problem. So marrying those things up together, that we were trying to think about all the layers and how they stack together.
Yeah, that's the combination kind of holistic approach you're talking about, right? Where the application, the video streams, things like that, they do touch on the network, or maybe the network is the thing that's broken, but it could be 20 other things. And tracking those things and trending all of those things is what I've seen as being different. It used to be, different department was graphing and monitoring that stuff, and then, like you're saying, your combined approach too, getting that on one piece of paper and looking at it is important, right?
Yeah, the industry in the networking world has, I think, together across all of the different players in this space, has really transformed. Now we're in a place where it's not just having open source software, but it's having industry standards, which have helped to push things along. We don't have to necessarily have all these translation tools. Here's how you do it on this platform. Here's another way to do it on another. If there are slight tweaks that we need to accommodate for, they're usually cosmetic. And as we see these pieces come together, if I were to look at 3 runners in the race, basically systems team took off, they're sprinting ahead. Systems have been, running with whether it was Ansible or other tooling, and now they're even beyond that. So now there's so many different tools that kind of support that ecosystem. Networking is, a little bit laggard behind and is starting to catch up as we have, OpenConfig and other players in that space. And then I'd say at the far, tail end of it, it's going to be proprietary systems, other industry, like broadcast equipment, things that they're just not running at the same pace. And that's frankly, it's worrying to me because, we're trying to treat systems and networks in an almost, similar way, and you're going to have always these other pieces that are going to kind of water down the solution. So,
But
if
that's the
I were to view
reality, right? That's the
yeah,
messy reality of what you guys do. It's
right, right. Yeah, and it'll probably always be the case, as we continue to integrate with other pieces. But there's a lot of learnings in, just how the systems have pushed networking to this next level.
Yeah, and what I would say, and what I really enjoy here is it's not that we're being pushed or networking isn't being pushed to the next level. It's the systems team is basically giving us a hand and pulling us up, right? And they're pulling us up not just with the ideas of the technology or the methodologies, but we're embarking on this new way about network observability that's coming directly from the systems team, right? And by doing that, all of the people that work on that system and all of their knowledge and technologies that they have been investing over the years on that, we're now being uplifted. The network team is now being uplifted into that. So rather than isolating all of the networking monitoring metrics and whatnot in some siloed application like some SNMP product from yesteryear, we're now a chair at that table with everybody else in infrastructure. And so, all of the programming techniques and widgets and dashboards and, automations through Terraform and all of those really excellent things you hear about, we get the benefit of all of that technology without having to do all the work ourselves in networking because the systems folks are giving us the hand up. And the direct benefit of that is that our velocity of getting observability in the network is, orders of magnitude faster than, just doing it on our own. We're going together, we're going fast. So it's really incredible to see that kind of interworking relationship in an organization.
So how do you bridge the gap though? Because networking is the laggard, right? And systems has gone off and they're like, everything's cloud native, Prometheus, all the logging and distributed tracing and all of the cool tools are all with systems. And networking is still like, yeah, got a bit of syslog here. You can have some of that. Maybe some SNMP. Maybe you can query us for some, here's a REST API and here's some metrics. How do you bridge that gap when network is lagging to kind of bring that up so that you can bring all the networking data into your observability tools so that everybody can access it?
Yeah, well, there's two components to that. One is an organizational component. And it doesn't matter. The technology is almost, it doesn't matter if you don't have the organizational support. Because if nobody cares, then it doesn't matter what your technology is, right? Yeah. So, first off, if you're in an organization that cares deeply about, this benefit, and a company like, a firm like MLB does, because the network is a critical liability to our operations. It's not a revenue generator. We don't, we're not a service provider, but if the network fails, then the business fails. And so there's a top-down commitment and a continuous push to make this happen. It isn't a nice to have here. It's like we have to do this.
That's an intrinsic part of your service.
Yeah, and once your mind shift goes into, well, we got to row the boat as hard as we can, then rowing the boat isn't a question anymore, and we're beyond that. The technology bits and pieces. You hire smart people and innovative people, and you give them the their ability to run as fast and hard as you want. Like Truman said, we're not married to specific. You have to do it a certain way, and there's a lot of open thinking here, and it's great. We still use I still use SNMP to pull data out of boxes, but I put them into a modern observability platform that, guess what, has an adapter for SNMP, amongst other things. So, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's good stuff in SNMP. I used to be a very, I don't like SNMP and it's terrible. And I this last 3 or 4 months, I've lost that religion, and I've embraced SNMP for what it is.
It's another tool. Yeah.
It's just another way of getting data in. Are there better ways? Sure, but it's not about
maybe
the better technology. Sometimes it's not about being right. It's about being successful. So we do.
Well, that's kind of the new approach, right? That I'm seeing, right? People they don't care about the different data sources. They just want them in a place to do something good with them. And that's what your business is about, right? And that's the kind of the leap you have to make between the tech and the thing you want to do with the tech, right?
Yeah, but I do want to answer Dave's. There's one very important element though to bridge the gap, and that is the what I would call the metadata associated with all of the metrics that we pull in, because it's the metadata that makes it business relevant. Like, what is the purpose of this interface? Is it a WAN MPLS interface, or is it something that's connecting to a video camera that the multimedia team cares about? And when you pull the data out, you have to enrich it with all this metadata, and then you throw it into a big, data lake. And then other organizations can go, oh, I'm the multimedia team. Show me everything you got for multimedia, in this ballpark. And they can see that enriched data, and it gives it context and meaning for them. That's how you bridge that gap.
Yeah, I think also what I would add is it is a long-term planting of a seed, and in the organization to see the results, grow. I think it takes time. It's around hiring the right people, changing the thinking. I'm sure if you even search on LinkedIn, you'll probably still find systems administrators. Like, they're out there now.
Oh, we work with them all the time. Yeah, I mean, they're still out there running REL, for the last 15 years or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a traditional way to handle, building infrastructure and running it and operating it. To the point that Jeremy raised around, we can't do it another way. That's exactly the case, because the team has we have a size that accommodates our business, and we have a quality metric that we're looking for. So how do you meet that quality metric? You use tools and you do things in an automated way. Now, to kind of tie it back to networking, from the 20 something years that I've been doing networking, I'd have to say that like most operators of networks don't really have visibility. They don't really know what the network is doing. Like, yeah, sure, they started with MRTG and they graphed some things up in the past, but
graphs do you really stats, but do you really know?
Do you really know? And beyond, what is your forwarding table looking like, and when do you have drops? And I think what we have now is there's something really cool to talk about, which is like the technologies that are available to us today. They answer some of these questions in a almost like an authoritative stance. Like, have you dropped a packet? Where did you drop a packet? Which packet did you drop? These types of things can actually, be realized today with, whether it's, INT and other, programmable data planes, but also just this idea that because we have all these new tools that the systems teams have offered up, whether it's Prometheus and Kibana, Grafana, all of that, like, you can make this stuff look pretty. You can look at it immediately. It's not going to be this, 5-minute average of sampled data coming off an old, Ethernet port. So my view is optimism. I really think that like we're at a cool place now where things are going to get better, and the tooling's helping us.
Yeah, I think it's cool that the network is becoming less of a black box to the people that are using it as well. And likewise, with the applications running on top of it, are no longer black boxes to the network team, because it's so much easier to be able to have an application say, I was making a DNS request and then things went horribly wrong, than having to get the network to be able to say, what was that packet? The one that I dropped? Oh, right. It was UDP 53. Cool.
And that's usually 10 minutes later.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Those are the two things that plague us. It's BGP and DNS all the time, right? I mean, that's as it should be.
Always DNS.
But one of the things which, I've loved with the interaction with systems teams offering up solutions is that, enterprises running Anycast services, having DNS, a protected effectively Anycast, around an environment, the amount of issues that has solved is just dramatic. It's little things like this, and they chip away at resiliency problems. And now they're easy to get. Like this is not just for the mega hyperscale folks. So I think we're at a cool inflection point.
Yeah, I mean that's like your comment about BGP appearing in data centers and things. Like that used to be complete heresy, and now people are going, hey, this might be a better way to do your data center, setup. And at the end of the day, it's like you guys are saying too. It's like at the end of the day, it's just more tech that's rolled in there that gets your job done. It's not as that it's BGP anymore. Who cares? It's like it gets me the right thing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think, even whether it's introductions of BGP or other technologies that modernize to some extent enterprises and data centers, there's another element which is happening, which is simplification. And I think we can't, we don't want to lose track of that. So we're talking about new things, whether it's Slack Ops, DevOps, all these other things that are affecting our operational function, but we're also taking things off the table. We're taking off like high touch, we're taking off complex networking stacks that used to exist in the past with fairly esoteric or, difficult to understand technologies like, wow, like topology change notification from, some layer 2 BPDO. Does anyone know it? Probably networking people don't even know it. So, at this point in time, like as you pull out these complex things, you're left with a framework, and some of that framework is pretty solid and feels like you want to build cool things on top of it that add to your business. So, I think that's kind of the strong point, which is try to simplify as much as possible. And my philosophy on networking has always been like, if you can't explain the packet flow in 2 sentences, it's probably the wrong approach.
It's probably too complicated.
Yeah.
Speaking of simplicity, are you guys using Kubernetes?
Lots of Kubernetes. For all the benefits of containerization and orchestration, and I guess what I would kind of link that back to is there's plenty of container orchestration that's needed in off-premise cloud, i.e. real cloud, and then there's on-premise cloud, and that's how I refer to the infrastructure that lives within the data centers. I think if we continue to say there's on-prem and there's cloud, I mean, it actually continues to have this bifurcation of intention and the way you consume it. And I think long-term, what we'd want to have is, like a simple way and a good, clear vision on how you deploy. And then if we agree that containerization is good, I mean, and there are plenty of pros to say that is the right approach for 90+% of the workload, then we should kind of standardize on what does it look like to deploy that. And, I understand I'm been a long time OpenStack user from, and each thing that comes through will say, oh, wow, here's a better way to do it. And then those projects grow, and there's lots of other pieces that add more complexity to it. But I think for the benefits that we get with K8s is been really substantial. And way back in the day when I worked at a financial organization that loved to have like isolated binaries, we would static compile massive binaries, pre-container, pre-Linux, virtualization, all of that, and got similar results. I look at containerization as, a step along the, I guess the long-term view on systems, and we'll see where that goes. I mean, I like what it's delivering today.
Like that's what I wanted to ask you. Like, is it? This is the thing we're starting to see in the industry, like the usual, the other side of the curve, right, from containers now, and people are realizing they're not good for every single problem in the universe, right? And are you guys seeing that? And then maybe can you talk about what problems are better solved with other things versus containers?
What I would offer up is one is just to talk about bare metal. I mean, bare metal has always had benefits from less abstraction, right? So if you need to talk to the hardware, and there's plenty of workloads today that are going to leverage GPUs and other, devices, there are plenty of ways to pipe that up to a container or to a VM, and that might be one approach. But there's also a concern that the more mechanical pieces in a system, it just adds more complexity and potentially has some performance penalties. Having equipment at ballparks that performs, video ML functions, it leads you to a conclusion that you want to talk to your hardware pretty closely, and then other areas where you might think around, various security concerns, where maybe you want to talk directly to hardware as well and have isolation. There may be some thoughts there as to why you may not need a container. So and then of course the long-term concern is also just systems that have long been virtualized in virtual machines, and where's the appropriate place to run those? So I think you just need to have an environment that supports your business critical needs, and like containers make sense for developers today. And this idea that things come and go and crashing is okay, and like that's a beautiful concept built into containers. But I do think in the past I would look at everything from the microkernel approaches and all these other interesting things that are happening in systems land. They're worth knowing. There's one more piece to touch it back to the network. So what do you think of when you think of like a VM? I mean, from a network point of view, it's usually an IP address. And from a container point of view, it could be an IP and it could be a port. And there's this weird demuxing of application back to network. And I think we, as a industry, need to think about what is right for us. And so I'll just kind of leave it there because I don't know the conclusion to that answer, but I think it's worth exploring that.
And that last piece is the thing we're literally struggling with right now, right? Which is like, I'll call them real-time workloads, and how they consume the hardware underneath. And maybe it's easier to run them as a VM at this point, because they're getting containerized, but the gymnastics required to get the actual hardware, committed piece of hardware to be utilized by the containers is far from easy, far from simplistic. And then it's and then the operations thing and debugging and telemetry and all that stuff. So that's kind of what my open question was, is about, like, are you guys seeing that? So clearly you are. Jeremy, you got a thought on that?
Well, I mean, I'm a user of that tech. For example, that chat ops system is deployed and operated through
Those are containers, right?
Yeah, it's like, well, it is, but I don't really know that. I mean, essentially the systems team have created a mechanism by which I check in a YAML file, that contains the resources and the kind of the idempotent information about the service. And then through the magic of CI/CD and containers and whatnot, it runs, and we have all the tooling that takes it from, YAML file to operational in the cloud. And we have all the tooling and the commercial products and the integrations that are done. And so my barrier to entry is very low as a user of that technology. Is Kubernetes extraordinarily complicated, and does it have a lot of sharp edges? Yes, it does. Do I feel those edges? No, I don't, because I get the benefit of all the systems engineering work that has gone into supporting the other parts of our business, which are the apps and so forth. But now as a network person who wants to deploy network monitoring specific apps or chat op type systems, I benefit from that, which I enjoy very much. It isn't without, its learning curve, right? I've learned a great deal, and we have got a great team that supports all of these systems, so nothing comes for free. But the friction, my use of the friction is very low, which as a user is great.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like the reason why I love doing this podcast is every now and then a really good nugget of wisdom falls out of these conversations. And I think you just said one, which was when the user doesn't care, the user just wants a certain kind of experience, the container approach is ideal. When you start caring, like Truman was giving examples of, things that really need a piece of hardware dedicated to that thing, maybe a container is not the right approach, But it's a good way to think about it anyway. It's a good way to frame it in my mind.
I think,
you guys.
Sorry, Brian.
Truman really honed in on I think one of the biggest struggles that networking people have with Kubernetes, and that's the application layer. So if we look back, load balancers were just the black box of networking 10, 15 years ago. And it was the flip of a coin. Who manages that? Is it going to be systems people, or is it going to be the network person? Well, we want to get somebody in networking that's kind of system savvy, because this is, you need to understand the application layer a little bit. And now we're saying, we're just going to disaggregate that whole damn thing, and everybody's going to be a load balancer now. So we're going to take that one load balancer that was kind of complex, and we're going to explode it all over. And we're doing the same with firewalls too. So do your teams, are they involved in that? Because now Jeremy kind of said, well, it's a systems problem. So is it systems people that now need to understand how load balancers work? And is that going to be the ownership? I mean, that demarc is brutal.
Yeah, I think we're flexible with who's actually going to take the ticket or work it through, being that
Right.
all of it sort of falls within one master team, one kind of holistic view of the environment. But
That's awesome.
yeah. But I think to your point, all these things will be distributed challenges, and as we work it through, like my concern on one part of networking has been special features have largely been on a stick. And so like slow data path elements are pretty terrible, and it's usually like, oh, here's a special thing, like let's route through it, and then, let's put in like, multi-millions of dollars of top of rack switches that do like, 3.2 tera each, and then let's put like a 10 gig firewall in the middle and like destroy our.
Yeah, that never happens. No.
Right, exactly. I mean, it'd be crazy if that happened, but that's why I think the beauty of this possibility is that some things being distributed as a service, and as we figure out how to own that, we move back to full velocity again. And the load balancer side, you raised some good questions. Some networking folks historically may not have known about why do you need a sticky SSL transaction, because looking at cookies and other authentication mechanisms. So I think long term, it's something we have to figure out. It's definitely changing, and I think more of these embedded functions are making their way through the network. Long term, if I were to compare it back to other areas of innovation, I've seen financial organizations that have had 100,000 to 150,000 machines, and they decided to do static DNS Etsy hosts and sync those things, as opposed to and there was some like rationale along the way where someone said, look, this makes sense because it's you don't have to do all this dynamic stuff and it works every time, and you're like, you just reinvented like DNS. Like, what are you talking about? It's a terrible
just
solution.
Reinvented a spreadsheet. That's what he did.
Yeah, this is a terrible idea. But I think if you look at some of the thinking, which had made sense, all of a sudden you flip it on its head and you say, look, there's a better way to do this. And I think that's what we're going to see in load balancing. I hope it continues to be a service and not a box.
Nice. I know we're running short on time, so I got to ask two questions. So one is open source. What are the tools you guys use? I've been kind of doing an inventory lately, and I'm like, wow, there's no clearinghouses anymore that kind of says, here's what network open source tools. That's something we need to do collectively as a community. And the other question, so MLB is distributed as it gets. What are you doing with that far edge node? Are you dropping compute there? Are you running kube stacks, on-prem, so you're not hairpinning data? The data gravity comes into play, so you're paying more money if you're shipping, data offsite. So maybe a little bit about what your strategy is on the edge too.
Okay, let me take the last question, and then I think Jeremy can speak to the tooling. So the idea around distributed edge, or having some of the let's say some things that live within the data center, some things live within cloud. So much of that has been an area where we've tried to have some very similar tooling, to the point where we're looking to have object storage, cloud compute, the same tooling that we use to deploy within the major cloud providers. We also use on our edge. So we're doing that. 30 of the ballparks, and we're continuing to build out local workloads. So I think it should feel the same. That's the intent, is to make the developer experience the same, and so we can have deployments that just, it doesn't really matter where but it's a similar build process and CI/CD deployment process. So that's the goal long term, and I think as needed, we'll build some things in-house as we need to, like if it makes sense. But we're trying to use most of the big packages that you guys are, across.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And to answer your question, Brent, I mean, my kind of go-to-market philosophy has always been, buy commercial when you can, borrow from the open source, if it's appropriate, and build when you must, right? So, I look at open source as a vehicle to fill a gap, and not so much as, should we go with open source first, right? Are there open source approaches for, getting something accomplished? Sure, but then it means that, I'm the cost, right?
It's not your only option, kind of
yeah,
thing.
yeah. There's no free lunch in any of these things, and where I was, looking at this kind of problem 5 years ago, I would have said, oh yeah, use Ansible to do blah blah blah, right? Because you can do a lot of things with it, but then it starts getting in your way, and then you're spending all your time just kind of pulling data off the network. There's no real value in that. You need the data, but there's no real value in in that. So if you can buy a commercial tool to get you the data, and then you spend all your intellectual time writing to a controller's API to use the data in a business, value purpose, then that makes sense to me.
It gets the job done, like you were saying. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing we're seeing, right? A lot of people over-rotating on I've got to have everything open source only, and it leads to other problems. I mean, it's not that it's bad or anything. It's just it's got a cost, and you got to know you got to know what you're doing, and like you're saying, I mean, there might just be a tool that gets the job done, or you build your own, and that's cool too,
Yeah.
Other ones.
Yeah. I mean, I always look at the open source as kind of the community aspect of the open source, meaning if there's something people are using and they can help each other, uplift each other through the process, because, there's a lot of network engineers that are still just getting started, or they're just trying to figure it out, or, what does a good Python program to, do X look like? There's the community side of the open source, which is really, to me, more important than just the technology side.
Awesome. Right. I think that brings us around to time. Thank you, Truman and Jeremy. This has been awesome. I thoroughly enjoyed talking to you both. We will leave links in the show notes for where people can follow you on social media and whatever else there. But really, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thanks for having us.
It's been great.
It was great.
Love to have you on again in the future if you guys are up for it too.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks.
Cool. Maybe after a real conference we can get together in the future, hopefully.
And a real beer.
And a real beer
Again
too.
days.
Hey, thanks guys.
All right.
All right.
Thank
Thanks
you.
everybody. This is this has been the Net, and I hope you'll join us again next time.